In Shakespeare's The Tempest, King Prospero is a skilled manipulator, using illusions to control those around him on his island. Similarly, society can create illusions through laws and norms to shape how we see things. However, Prospero's manipulations, driven by betrayal and self-interest, offer only temporary escape from the truths he wants to avoid. He serves as a warning that while illusions may briefly hide the truth, reality is relentless, and delaying its acknowledgement only makes it worse. In 1976, California's Assembly Bill 489 was the legal catalyst in separating gender from biological sex, where private relationships could exist without regard to gender identity or sexual orientation. Like Prospero's magic, this bill had far-reaching effects in changing societal perceptions, paving the way for more illusions. By 2011, it had influenced 5 other states, leading to a broader societal movement that has become the razor's edge in cutting off the ability to separate fantasy from reality. Societal changes weren't solely confined to state laws. Title IX, a federal act from 1972, was introduced to combat sex-based discrimination in public schools and has largely been successful in that endeavor. Known for its notable assertion that no person in the U.S. shall be subjected to discrimination on the basis of sex, Title IX paved the way for more women to participate in sports and STEM fields. The directive here was clear: abide by its principles or risk losing federal funding. But these changes were not without complexities. Increasing women's participation in STEM led schools to recalibrate their sports programs, resulting in both the addition of female teams and the reduction of male ones for schools to stay within compliances. The narrative took another turn in 2011. Former President Obama, through the Dear Colleagues letter, urged a revision of Title IX's stance on campus sexual assault. While this was much needed and generally welcome, it also set the dangerous precedent that the government could reinterpret and influence the law to change without actually going through the lengthy process of changing it. Come 2016, the parameters expanded further as gender identity was incorporated as a class and later used to overshadow sex-based protections. Though the Trump era saw these inclusions being contested, Biden's tenure reinstated and broadened them. Distinct from Prospero's island of illusions, the realm of gender identity and biological sex presents real, tangible issues and harms. The concept of gender identity, though often argued as innate in recent legislation, is revealed as more fluid through processes like medical transitions, altering legal documents, and personal pronoun preference. All of these are counterintuitive to the concept of innate quality or a characteristic.
I was easy to manipulate and convince that I had been born in the wrong body.
There's been testimony for a Senate bill banning Texas doctors from helping transgender minors transition.
I was told that changing my gender would cure me.
And testimony against that proposed ban, too.
And I am a transgender woman who transitioned 28 years ago. Best decision I ever made. Best decision I ever made. Decision.
In the span of half a century, gender legislation has rippled across educational institutions, businesses, medical arenas, and households. They've tread lines between the biological reality of sex and the evolving concept of gender, blurred lines between reality and personal choice, but perhaps the most important thing is they've confused the terms right and entitlement. A right can be thought of as an intrinsic privilege, protected by legal frameworks, which guarantees an individual the liberty to act or to be in a certain condition. On the flip side, entitlements offer benefits, but these are contingent upon belonging to a particular class or meeting certain criteria. In simple terms, rights exist naturally and are protected by law, but entitlements don't exist without being made into law. This is a critical distinction when any and every discussion about gender legislation occurs. It's not uncommon to hear or see advocates chanting trans rights are human rights, but this is problematic in a couple of ways. One, it implies a separate class of human rights that requires special recognition, meaning it isn't innate. And two, the mantra is used when making a demand for entitlements, not a right. Why do people go with this mantra if it's so out of touch and inaccurate? We might be able to find the answer in a few behavioral studies. For example, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. This experiment illustrated the disturbing lengths people will go to follow orders under the guise of authority.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please. Wrong. 195 votes. Dance.
The experiment requires that you
I know
continue.
it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful,
Yeah,
they're not
but I mean,
dangerous.
he's yelling in there.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
What do I tell him? We're going over it again?
No, just go ahead.
If in this study, an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. This experiment highlighted how quickly individuals adopt and intensify roles when given power, even in a simulated environment.
What about the kids who didn't break down? They became zombies. Zombies in the sense that they became almost all mindlessly obedient. Whatever the guards would say, they did. Do this, they did. Do 10 push-ups, do 20 push-ups. Step on him while he's doing a push-up. Tell him he's a bastard.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
Solomon Asch's Conformity Experiments. This demonstrated the tendency for individuals to abandon their own judgments, go against their self-interest, just to align with their perceived peer group.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white T-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2,
2, 2, 2,
2,
3,
3,
3, 3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2,
2,
2, 2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
Not only did these experiments come under intense ethical scrutiny, but they underscore how susceptible individuals are to social pressure, cautioning against the dangers of blind conformity. In the context of gender discourse, it's concerning to see that these well-established patterns of influence are not only ignored, but oftentimes the same methods and tactics are used for the purpose of the same outcome. We can see this pattern emerge when we look at the historical arc of gender legislation. We can see the push is no longer about rights, but about redefining reality and manipulating perceptions. Take the progression of California's legislation. The 2017's SB 179's shift in language markers set the stage for 2021's SB 132's changes within the California prison system. California's SB 179, also known as the Gender Recognition Act, ushered in a significant shift by allowing individuals to change their sex markers on official documents without requiring a physician's certification. In essence, it introduced the notion that personal claims take precedence as long as the claimant states that it is not for any fraudulent purpose. Unlike the courtroom oath regarding perjury, which has objective measures and requirements for evidence, this law lacks practical enforcement of its own perjury clause. Prioritizing claim, regardless of verifiable standards, finds an interesting parallel in the case of the NFL team formerly known as the Washington Redskins, now the Washington Commanders. Many Native Americans had long expressed their distress over the team's name and logo, considering it racist and mocking of their identity. To retain the name and logo, the team commissioned a survey aiming to demonstrate that most Native Americans weren't offended by it at all. However, the credibility of this poll was questioned as it relied on people's self-identification as Native American. The National Congress of American Indians, representing 1.2 million people from numerous tribes, said using self-identified Native Americans was oversimplified, offensive, and dismissive of the generational and historical hardships faced by Native Americans. The poll, issued in 2004, has been reviewed numerous times in the last 20 years, each time supporting the views of the NCAI. Corporations like Walmart, Target, Amazon, FedEx, and Nike took a stand by pulling merchandise and threatening the refusal of doing business with the team if it didn't change its offensive name. Additionally, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, urged broadcasters not to use the team's name in broadcasts, and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, argued that while the team had a First Amendment right to choose the name, it stood behind the NCAI in its call upon federal, state, and local governments to, quote, end any preferential tax, zoning, or policy treatment that could be viewed as supporting the franchise as long as it retains its current team name. Former President Obama was among the high-profile political leaders who added their voice to urging the name change, and the Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County, Virginia, where the team is headquartered, also sent a letter insisting the team change its name. According to World Bank census data, in 2022, women accounted for 50.5% of the U.S. population, roughly equivalent to 166 million individuals. A significant majority of these women have expressed their unease concerning the inclusion of men in their private spaces, sports competitions, and appropriation of identity through self-identification. However, Walmart, Target, Amazon, FedEx, and Nike sponsor transgender product lines, self-identifying women and athletes, or make press releases to highlight their support of transgender initiatives. In Loudoun County, Virginia, school superintendent Scott Ziegler covered up 2 rapes committed by a transgender student in May and October of 2021. First at the student's original school, and then again at the school the student was subsequently transferred to when the first rape was discovered and reported. Both instances occurred in the girls' bathroom. Simultaneously, the ACLU has taken legal action, asserting that policies not accommodating preferred names and pronouns constitute hate speech and are harmful, while the ADL has endorsed the use of preferred pronouns in broadcasting, irrespective of whether it conflicts with the interests of a protected class, and many political leaders have defended self-identification as a sufficient form to affirm someone's identification. This begs the question, why is the name of a football team seen with more urgency than that of an entire sex class demographic? Deciding where to house transgender inmates has become an intricate and sometimes very contentious issue. At face value, housing individuals based on their gender identity might not seem like that big a deal. However, with bills like 179 allowing self-ID without any safeguard, larger and more sobering concerns about the safety and well-being of the female inmate population exist. SB 132, known as the Transgender Respect, Agency, and Dignity Act, states the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, is required to house the person in a correctional facility designated for men or women based on the individual's preference. However, CDCR may deny housing preference if there are management or security concerns, but the incarcerated person can challenge the decision. The law also provides that an inmate cannot be disciplined for refusing to respond or for not disclosing complete information. They can, at any time, update their information regarding their gender identity. Not only does this further dissolve the perjury clause in SB 179, SB 132 adds a layer of entitlement to people who have already been labeled as breaking public trust in some way.
Like, what's the, I mean, I know what the policy and protocol is, but what happens when people are caught, in the act, whether it's consensual or non? What happens?
Well, first of all, they just made an announcement this week that no means no and yes is not allowed. So there's not supposed to be any romantic contact happening between inmates at all. It's supposed to be a zero tolerance.
That's exactly what I put.
Your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
That's actually exactly what I wrote in the caption of the original tweet, that no means no and yes, it's not allowed, which comes from PREA.
I mean, say that. PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And when a male and a female have been caught in the act, as you say, in the past, there's basically a verbal reprimand. Get away from her, get away from him, separate, bring one person out of the cell or the room. There's just a conversation that's had, maybe a warning, a verbal warning, and that's it. There's no rule violation. There's no person held in the cage. There's no asset placement. There's none of that.
No.
You may not even get a documentation anywhere that even occurs.
So, if no means no and yes is not permitted, the institution's regulations stipulate that sexual contact is inherently non-consensual. Although the precise figures regarding sexual assaults in prisons that house men and women's quarters are difficult to track, evidence does exist that trans women inmates have fathered children with female inmates. The CDCR is a state agency that is responsible for managing the state's prison system, including incarceration and rehabilitation programs, rules, and regulations. Since sexual contact occurs in environments where consent cannot exist, it seems that there's dual responsibility. The state must investigate and charge the offense of rape, but also be held accountable for creating the environment and circumstances that facilitate it. Advocates of trans women in women's prison point to abuse numbers of trans women, using the risk and statistics of sexual assault to justify housing, but downplay and ignore the statistics and risk of danger faced by real women in greater numbers in these same situations. It serves to undermine the very essence of sex-segregated spaces, but it's not just the prison system being impacted, it's everyday society too. In the latter half of the 20th century, scholars began probing the underpinnings of male violence, examining its societal, cultural, and biological origins. Evidence repeatedly suggested differences in criminal actions based on biological sex, pointing to variations in crime types and frequencies based on both perpetrator and victim sexes. Key publications like the U.S. Department of Justice's Sex Differences in Violent Victimization and Sex Differences in Antisocial Personality and Borderline Personality Disorders from the Clinical Psychology Review detailed these variances. Tracing back, there's a long-standing intrigue regarding behavioral differences between sexes, embodied in work like Konrad Lorenz's 1963 On Aggression. Lorenz theorized aggression exists naturally in human nature, with males possibly being more inclined due to evolutionary factors. In 1975, E.O. Wilson published Sociobiology: The New Synthesis, which further explored behavioral biology, spotlighting sex-based behavior contrasts. Research by Dobash and Dobash in the 1970s accentuated male violence in domestic settings. But we can also look at the impact of other things, like 1994's Hate Crimes Sentencing Enhancement Act, which was crafted to intensify penalties for bias-driven crimes. Given that studies consistently point to violence trends leaning more toward biological sex than gender identity, adding gender-focused categories to such legislation muddies its central intent. This inclusion carries the risk of complicating data accuracy and making genuine sex-based crime patterns less apparent. Moreover, the diverse and dynamic nature of gender identity intensifies the challenge in framing and classifying gender-based hate crimes, leading to even more legal gray area. Coincidentally, 1994 also saw the enactment of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. VAWA was pivotal in acknowledging rape as a violent crime, emphasizing that marital status does not equate to perpetual sexual consent. Considering the wealth of data on violence targeting women, it's startling that such a perspective only became law 29 years ago. Considering the pace of protective measures for women, Title IX, not even half a century old, saw its sex-based defenses compromised. Medical professionals now advocate terminology like chest feeding under the guise of respecting individual dignity. Again, rights are not a sentiment. Putting emphasis on gender identity dilutes originally targeted legal protections, warping crime reports to cater to emotional perspectives of the person rather than the factual perspectives of the crime. If the current laws used to protect women are based on decades of evidence and research, then what does the shift in focus actually protect? It's concerning when rushed laws seem to suggest that someone can lay claim to something they don't naturally possess, especially over someone who genuinely holds that identity. It's not like we don't have constant historical reminders of what this leads to. But maybe that's just the twist in the current legal landscape. More old rich white guys buying things that aren't for sale. It compels us to ask, why is there a leaning toward ignoring history, whether it's the blowback of forced assimilation, social colonization, cultural appropriation, or risk factors that put forward the need for protection in the first place, especially since the outcome of these situations are always historically the same? While we might never receive a direct answer, it leads us to a few weeks from now, in part 2 of our multi-part series on gender legislation, where we look at the modern currents of society, monetary influences, educational shifts, and reshaping family structure under the thumbscrew of gender legislation. Until then,